This video is sponsored by the International Society for Primal People. Bigfoot of the Blues by Vance Orchard. Chapter 6. Many people came to check out this Bigfoot of the Blue Mountains report. His life was never to be the same for Paul Freeman after June 10, 1982. That was the day of his close, very close encounter with the Bigfoot of the Blues. He reported the sighting to his superiors, the Walla Walla Ranger District Office of the Umatilla National Forest. Then a lot of assorted hell broke loose. Largely across the broad shoulders of the Forest Service watershed rider, Paul Freeman. Today, Freeman will tell you, "I don't think I'd have reported seeing a Bigfoot if I knew then what I know now." What he means is that what happened to him, and even to his children, the entire Freeman family suffered ridicule over phone lines, despite a continual changing of enlisted numbers, and at school the children were given similar treatment by their peers. The Freemans made a couple of house moves in the Walla Walla area, then moved to western Washington. At the time, Freeman was determined to vindicate that he had truly seen a Bigfoot. He still does. He returned to the Blue Mountains whenever he heard reports of Bigfoot tracks or other evidence. Like a man obsessed or driven, Freeman made several trips back from western Washington. Usually he arrived several days after the sighting was reported to him. Often it was longer, as he had a business to take care of. So, making another adjustment, he brought his family back to the Blue Mountains country and made their home in Walla Walla. This way, he was able to stay on top of all reports. The move also enabled him to reach a few hunting spots in a relatively few minutes from his home. Over the years since returning to Walla Walla, Freeman has probably visited the Blues 2 to 4 times a week on an average. Some people ask the question, how come Freeman sees all the Bigfoot stuff? It's a pretty good question, but one which ignores the fact that Freeman spends so much time in the mountains, probably more than anyone else, including Forest Service personnel. But others too have sought the elusive Bigfoot of the Blues. Many agencies and individuals have been here to see for themselves. It started, of course, with a pretty intensive by the Walla Walla district of the Umatilla National Forest, in whose territory the 1982 sighting had been made. This investigation was to continue, and still does to some extent, through the appearance in 1986 of the team of investigative reporters from ABC's Good Morning America. Wayne Long, now retired and living in Walla Walla, was a veteran of many years in the woods when the Bigfoot sighting hit his desk. Although his main job with his district was fire control officer, Long was assigned the Bigfoot matter, probably because of his longtime service in the Blues. The size of the footprint made by the creature encountered by Freeman was a big issue for Long. Although he had been a woodsman for 35 of his 44 years, Long said that he had never seen anything resembling the tracks made that day by the Freeman monster. "It's the first time I've ever seen a foot like this," Long told a UB reporter the day after Freeman came out of the hills to running into the Bigfoot. The UB story went on. "Long has been a busy man since the news report came out Friday that Paul Freeman, a Mill Creek watershed patrol rider, claimed he saw what looked like a Bigfoot around noon Thursday. Freeman said he saw a creature about 9 foot tall, with dark, reddish-black hair all over its body. He said the creature had long arms that hung to its knees and walked hunched over. Long and several other Forest Service employees spent Friday afternoon analyzing the tracks in an attempt to determine the weight of whatever or whoever made the nearly 25 impressions in the soil. While Forest Service officials declined to guess the weight of whatever made the footprints, Long has made a deduction about the plaster cast that measured 14 inches long and 7 inches at its widest point. "I don't think this thing was man-made," he said. "It was made by some creature. If it had been a single track or 2 tracks, I might dispute it. But 25 tracks?" Long and the Forest Service employees shaped a steel plate the same size as the plaster cast. After placing the plate under a truck and jacking up the back end of the vehicle to push the plate into the ground, Long said he still isn't sure how much weight caused the same footprints to be as deep as 2 inches. During the truck experiment, the steel plate penetrated the ground only about a half an inch. While the Forest Service does not plan to pursue further investigation of Thursday's incident, a Seattle-based organization will analyze the hairs found in the footprint cast and compare them to other hairs found at previous Bigfoot sightings. Project Bigfoot, which claims 85 members nationwide, collects data on all reported sightings, said the group's director, John Eric Beckjord of Seattle. Beckjord requested the Forest Service conduct Friday's truck experiment to determine the weight of the creature. He estimates the tracks were caused by something weighing more than 4,000 pounds. "Maybe this was a robot. Maybe it's like something alien," he said. "Indications are it's not an ordinary biological animal." These words by Beckjord are highly intriguing. They and their suggested subject matter will come up again in this book. My outdoors column for the UB that summer of '82 on several occasions carried mention of the Bigfoot matter. Usually, the UB column was the sole source of information in the prime media concerning the issue. This could include the electronic media, for TV had not yet gotten very excited about such things as Bigfoot. We were to be subjected to national TV exposure, however, in 1986. Of course, those who sought Bigfoot had ideas on what to do if a person sighted one or the encounter was pretty close. The following outdoors column of mine that summer had some answers to this. Amazon from Akron. One of the most unusual visitors of many who inundated the Walla Walla Ranger District when the Bigfoot sighting report came in was a woman from Akron, Ohio. Barbara Belenovich said she had been pretty deeply involved in this Bigfoot thing for 4 years and has been following his tracks with a great deal of enthusiasm in Ohio. Now, on a western jaunt to do her thing, the tall Ohioan heard of Walla Walla's sighting and headed this way. She claims she has seen lots of footprints in her forays wherever Bigfoot is sighted. The last I heard from her, she said she was going to spend the night in the mountains where Freeman saw the creature. Then she was heading for Mount Shasta in California, where several Bigfoot sightings have occurred. What to do? If you see one of the Bigfoots in the Blue Mountains, what should you do? Out of the conversation I have recently and the extensive reading I've done for several years, as well as the course of action taken by Freeman when he saw one, the consensus seems to be, don't do a thing that would agitate the Bigfoot. Several people shooting one should be the last resort and shouldn't be done because the thing is part of the woods like any other wildlife. Walla Walla artist Cliff Buehler painted his conception of Bigfoot several years ago when he was in the Middle Salmon River country of Idaho. The Bigfoot topic was a heavy one around the campfires. What he's guessed is quite close to the description given by hundreds of sightings reported in the Northwest and California. Buehler is one who feels strongly that even if we can't prove one is there, it should be protected. It would be a shame to shoot something like that, and I'd like to see something like that protected as a vital part of the wilderness area up there. Buehler, who has spent a lot of time in the woods, feels a Bigfoot creature could live in the Mill Creek watershed and not be seen if he didn't want to be. Firmest believer? One who claims to have seen not one, but 3 Bigfoots in the watershed is Wes Summerlin of Walla Walla, who has packed sportsmen and their elk out of the Blue Mountains for 45 years. He too feels the creature should not be shot. They are not harmful, he declares, but they can be dangerous. They are for real, so don't shoot them. Summerlin claims he has seen the Bigfoot reported by Freeman along with 2 others, including one which he claims had been shot by hunters about 15 years ago. There was a story about it at the time in your paper, he says. Summerlin says he is not the only person who has seen Bigfoot in the Blues, but so far has not wished to report them. These people are afraid of being ridiculed, he says. Wes Summerlin figured in another outdoors column of mine almost a year to the day after Freeman's encounter with Bigfoot of the Blues. The following from my UB column dated June 12, 1983. If ever there was a place in the Blue Mountains to shelter a bunch of Bigfoots, it would be the Burnt Fork. A look at the map of the Walla Walla district of the Umatilla National Forest might give a hint of that. But ride a horse down into that tight little valley, and you'd see for yourself what I mean. For just such a look, 3 riders dropped off Lewis Peak on a recent weekend and rode into the Burnt, and several hard-fought miles beyond before that lengthy weekend ran its course. Besides the rider, other mounted Bigfoot seekers were Wes Summerlin and Rick Yetzko. While Yetzko, veteran Baltimore-born cowboy and computer technician first class, has made a few trips into the area, the real vet was Summerlin. He has packed in and ridden more of the Blues than most who do this sort of thing. It was to that experience of Summerlin that we are to turn several times before we made it back to our Lewis Peak starting point. Yetzko, as a troubleshooting computer technician, does a lot of traveling around the country. As a youngster attending prep school, he was indoctrinated into the facts of the equestrian. He has been an ardent devotee of the saddle ever since, getting deeply involved in this hobby, and an equal involvement in the Blue Mountains has become an even more important part of his lifestyle. And Bigfoot and Wes Summerlin are just as big as in his life. This weekend horseback trip was inspired when Yetzko and his family had an experience on the Burnt which will forever be etched in their minds. It was while they were camped at their favorite spot there one evening that they had what they are convinced was at least a near encounter with a Bigfoot. It was just a scant year ago that the Bigfoot was sighted by Paul Freeman, and other tracks also were seen later. Here, the Yetzko family saw several huge tracks in the dust of the trail near their Burnt Fork campsite. Then, they were treated to a series of unusual whistling sounds reputedly made by Bigfoot in other reported encounters in the Blues and elsewhere in the Northwest. When the 3 headed back to that site a week later, We failed to find any of the tracks. Photographs taken at the time by the Yeskos will, however, back up their sighting. Changing weather conditions coupled with intensive use of the trail by game, mostly deer and elk, apparently removed tracks spotted 9 days before by the Yeskos. Wes, Rick and I had ample adventures before we completed our weekend jaunt into the Blues, including floundering around in deep snow, having the pack come unloaded from our mule and strewing it across a hillside, and losing a sleeping bag when it rolled off into the canyon near dusk. And snow covered so much of the terrain, we were forced to make camp in the snow, melting snow for coffee making, and eating dried nuts and fruit rations. This horseback caper a year after Freeman's close encounter was but one of the several which came in the years after June 10, 1982. I've already recounted the July 1982 sighting of the many Bigfoot tracks by Freeman and his fishing party. A year after the sighting by Freeman at the boundary of the watershed, the controversy was still simmering, of course, over what Freeman had seen that day. Then, a few weeks after the encounter in June, Freeman and several others found more excitement. They came upon a place where newly harvested wild mushrooms and skunk cabbage had been stacked in piles 3 and 4 feet high, he said, and surrounding the piles of vegetation were a lot of big footprints. We found tracks every place. We must have found 5,000 tracks, he said. We found so many tracks up there, we couldn't even follow them. And a year after the June 10, 1982 sighting, Freeman was recalling the experience, still with vividness to his recollection. He says the creature he came across that day on an abandoned logging road was just as alarmed as Freeman. He recalled that the creature's reddish-colored hair on his head and neck just kind of flipped forward 3 times. I could hear him breathing. That was the only sound he made. I turned and went for the truck. I dropped my keys. After I did get into the truck, I couldn't work the radio. I guess I was pretty excited. Then, and he does today, Freeman was not backtracking from what he claims he saw. He resigned from the Forest Service, he says, citing he was tired of the hassle and the pressure over the Bigfoot thing. But a year later, he was still excited thinking about that encounter. If I get to talking about that thing, I still get goosebumps on me. It scared the hell out of me, Freeman told Portland, Oregonian reporter Richard Cockle. On the first anniversary, in his 1983 story, Cockle recalls that Joel Hardin, a tracker for the U.S. Border Patrol, hired by the Umatilla Forest to investigate the Bigfoot of the Freeman report, examined the tracks found by Freeman and another patrolman. A year later, Cockle notes, Hardin still believes they were faked. Cockle said Hardin noted that the prints had been molded to the contour of the ground. The little bumps and imprints had rocks like feet of a flesh and blood animal might have done. Cockle said Hardin was convinced somebody had spent a lot of time preparing the plastic material for the feet. Others commented at the time that the tracks examined by Hardin and the tracks earlier found at the June 10th encounter site had differences. Those countering the Hardin findings at that time, of course, were the opinions of Dr. Grover Krantz, WSU anthropologist, who pronounced the tracks at the Freeman encounter were definite evidence that Sasquatch was real. The Forest Service, Cockle noted a year after the first encounter, had by then changed its stance on the Bigfoot matter. While at first, and especially after the Hardin opinion, the Forest Service had declared probable hope for the tracks. A year later, there had become a non-committal attitude. "We're just staying out of it," Walla Walla Ranger Gary Flanick said. "We're just reporting facts. We're not stating an opinion either way. As far as I know, this is the current attitude of the Forest Service." The Forest Service had ample reason to feel potential problems had been posed with the Freeman encounter. There was a good chance amateur Bigfoot hunters would simply ignore the entry restrictions for the watershed. A lot of requests to enter the watershed were fielded by the Forest Service, all of which were turned down, and still are today, along with a steady patrol of the watershed's perimeter and interior by Forest Service law enforcement officers, as well as the regular patrol riders. The ABC's Good Morning America crew spent most of 3 days on the scene in October 1986. They got a lot of footage of the deep canyons and mountains of the Blues. They covered it by land and by air, and even found a few tracks to picture in the documentary. When aired over a 3-day span, the films made a lot more Americans aware of Bigfoot, but also of the creatures who had taken up residence in the northern reaches of the Blue Mountains. But was this of recent date? Or did the Bigfoot story go back in time? There was ample evidence forthcoming, and possibly ABC's documentary helped spring some of it. Yes, there have been earlier reports of the Blue Mountain sightings, and there are plenty today as well. I was reminded recently of the early day reports, including footprints, which boggled the mind for size. I was talking to a Walla Walla friend, Gordon Bateman, as we shared some General Custer historical trivia. Then, having just read a Bigfoot account of mine, he asked if I wanted another story or two. I hurriedly responded, yes. Bateman's first account had to do with the time back in 1949 when he was in a party of deer hunters headed up the side of Griffith Peak near Dayton, Washington, one of the several mountains which ring the Mill Creek watershed. This is prime Bigfoot territory, of course. We were near the top when we spotted this figure, like a man stooped over somewhat, in the brush off to my left, Bateman said. I put my scoped rifle up and determined it was not a deer or an elk, so we just called it a wolf and went on. I don't think there were any wolves around here by 1949, but we weren't thinking in terms of Bigfoot those days. I think that's what it might have been, though. Then Bateman gave me the most interesting item for my Bigfoot records. His mother, Fern Corbett Bateman, had come west to Huntsville, Washington, a few miles east of Walla Walla on U.S. Highway 12, in 1892. Her father had bought the old flour mill there. One day in 1900, she went out to the garden behind the house near the Touchy River and foothills of the Blue Mountains, Bateman related. Then she sees this big, hairy, man-like creature standing, with one leg perched on the gate. She screamed and took off for the house. The Bigfoot ran off too, he added. And that account makes the earliest report of a Bigfoot encounter in the Blue Mountains, according to my records at least. The earliest information about Bigfoot I'd gathered prior to Bateman's story was the track sightings early in the 1940s. That concerned the story of Jim Ralph, retired Forest Service employee. In 1942, he was assigned to lookout duty at Hoodoo Lookout on the Walla Walla Ranger District. After spending the daylight hours in the lookout tower, Ralph would come down to spend the night in a log cabin at the base. One night, after retiring, he had the sensation someone was looking in his window. Checking outside, he could see nobody, so he went back to bed. The next morning, there was a set of huge footprints, toes pointing toward his window when he arose. Ralph recalls he followed the tracks leading away from the cabin for several blocks and had to return to duty in the tower. He said he covered the 2 tracks up the window with a voice dub until his boss came up from headquarters. He asked what was I going to do about him. Ralph said, I told him he was the boss and it was up to him. That's the last I ever heard of it, though. End of chapter.